I want you to picture something with me. It's 3 days before Christmas, and you're sitting across from someone who's just trying to survive. She's got 2 kids at home, rent that's already late, and she's looking at you like you're the only person standing between her and absolute collapse. Now, imagine your boss, someone who makes more in a month than she'll see in 5 years, tells you to let her go. Right there, right then, before the holiday. What do? I've spent 37 years listening to people tell me about the moments that broke them, the decisions that haunted them, the times they chose comfort over conscience. And I can tell you this, we like to think we'd be brave when it matters. We rehearse it in our heads, what we'd say, how we'd stand up, the moral clarity we'd have in that pivotal moment. But when your job is on the line, when your own family's security hangs in the balance, when the person with all the power is staring at you, waiting for obedience, that's when you find out who you actually are. This story isn't mine, but it lived in my office for months, unfolding session by session, and it changed how I understood the cost of doing what's right. The person who told it to me, let's call him Marcus, came to see me because he couldn't sleep. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. with his heart racing, replaying a conversation over and over, wondering if he'd destroyed his life or finally started living it. Before we go any further, I want to know, have you ever been in that position where doing the right thing meant risking everything you'd built? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're new here, welcome. I'm sharing these stories because I believe we learn who we are through the choices other people make. We see ourselves in their struggles. So stay with me. This one matters. Marcus was a regional manager for a mid-sized logistics company. Solid job, decent pay, the kind of position where you're important enough to make decisions, but not important enough to be protected when those decisions upset the wrong person. He'd worked his way up over 15 years, started in the warehouse, proved himself reliable, got promoted into management. He had a mortgage, 2 kids in middle school, a wife who'd gone back to school trusting that his income was stable. Everything was built on that job. The woman's name was Elena. She'd been hired 8 months earlier to work in accounts processing, data entry, invoice reconciliation, the kind of work that keeps a company running, but nobody notices until it's done wrong. Marcus remembered her interview. She was nervous, over-explained everything, apologized twice for being 5 minutes early. Single mom, 2 daughters, ages 6 and 9. She'd been out of the workforce for a few years, taking care of her mother who'd had a stroke. Her resume had gaps, but her references were strong, and she was willing to work any shift. He hired her. She was good at the job, quiet, kept her head down, never missed a deadline. But she'd been late 4 times in her first 6 months. Nothing egregious, 10 or 15 minutes, always with a reason. Daycare issue, car trouble. One of her daughters got sick at school and she had to pick her up. Marcus had documented it because that's what you do as a manager, but he'd never written her up. He knew her situation. He knew she was doing everything alone. And honestly, her work was clean. She stayed late when she had to. She never pushed back. Then the new CEO arrived. This is where the psychology starts to matter, so bear with me. When a new leader takes over an organization, especially someone brought in to turn things around, there's a predictable pattern. They need to establish dominance quickly. They need to signal that the old way of doing things is over, that they're not sentimental, that results matter more than relationships. It's a power play, and it almost always involves making an example of someone. The CEO's name was Richard. He'd come from a larger company, brought in by the board to cut costs and increase margins. Within his first month, he'd laid off 12 people, restructured 2 departments, and sent a company-wide memo about accountability and excellence. Marcus told me he got a sick feeling reading that memo. He'd seen this before. When leaders start talking about accountability that aggressively, it usually means they're about to punish people for being human. Richard called Marcus into his office on a Tuesday afternoon, December 18th. The office was already decorated. Someone had put up a tree in the break room, strung lights along the cubicles. People were planning their time off, buying gifts, trying to finish projects before the holiday shutdown. The energy was light, distracted. People were thinking about family, not work. Richard didn't waste time. He had Elena's file open on his desk. He pointed to the attendance records, 4 late arrivals in 6 months. He said the company couldn't tolerate unreliability, especially not now when they were trying to build a culture of discipline. He said examples needed to be set. He said Marcus should terminate her employment effective immediately and that it should be done before the holiday break so it wouldn't disrupt the new year. Marcus sat there, and this is the part he described to me in detail because it's the moment everything crystallized. He said he felt his body go cold, like someone had opened a door to winter right there in the office. His brain started doing this thing, calculating, running scenarios. If he pushed back, Richard might see him as weak, disloyal, not a team player. If he refused outright, he could be next. He had his own family to think about, his own kids, his own mortgage. The rational part of his mind was already forming the argument. This isn't personal, it's business. Elena will find another job. Maybe it's better for her long term. Maybe this will push her to find something with better hours, better pay. People lose jobs all the time. It's not the end of the world. But there was another voice, quieter, almost buried under the panic. And that voice said, "You know this is wrong." Here's what happens in your brain in moments like this. Your amygdala, the part that processes fear and threat, lights up like a firework. It floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline because your survival is being challenged. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that handles reasoning and moral judgment, is still working, but it's working slower. It's trying to find a solution that keeps you safe while also aligning with your values. And those 2 goals, safety and integrity, they don't always point in the same direction. Marcus asked Richard why. Why her? Why now? Why 3 days before Christmas? Richard said it wasn't about Christmas. It was about sending a message. People needed to know that performance mattered, that the company was serious. He said if Marcus wasn't willing to make tough calls, maybe he wasn't the right person for his role either. There it was. The threat. Not subtle. Not veiled. Marcus told me he looked down at the file. He saw Elena's name, her employee ID number, the notes he'd written when he hired her. He thought about her daughters, the way she'd mentioned them in passing, how one of them wanted to be a veterinarian, how the other one loved to draw. He thought about his own kids, about what it would mean if he came home and told his wife he'd been fired right before Christmas. And then he thought about what it would mean if he came home and told her he'd fired someone else right before Christmas because he was too afraid to say no. He looked up at Richard. He said, "I'm not doing that." Richard leaned back in his chair. Marcus said the silence felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably only a few seconds. Richard asked if Marcus understood what he was saying. Marcus said yes, he understood. Richard told him to think very carefully about his decision. Marcus said he had. He wasn't going to fire Elena 3 days before Christmas for being late a few times when her work was solid and her circumstances were hard. If Richard wanted her gone, he'd have to do it himself. Richard told him to get out of his office. Marcus left. He walked back to his desk. His hands were shaking. He didn't know if he still had a job. He didn't know if he'd just made the worst mistake of his career or the first real decision he'd ever been proud of. But here's the thing, and I want you to really hear this, because this is where most of us live, in that space between the bold move and the fallout. We imagine standing up for what's right as this clean, triumphant thing. We picture the music swelling, the crowd cheering, the validation arriving immediately. That's not how it works. What Marcus felt in that moment wasn't pride, it was terror. He felt sick. He felt stupid. He went home that night and barely spoke to his wife because he didn't know how to explain what he'd done or what it might cost. He told me later that he kept thinking, what if I just made my family's life harder because I wanted to feel like a hero? And that question haunts so many people who try to do the right thing. Because doing the right thing doesn't come with guarantees. It doesn't come with safety. It just comes with the knowledge that you couldn't live with the alternative. Where are you watching from right now? I'd love to know. Drop your city or country in the comments. There's something powerful about knowing we're all scattered across the world, hearing the same story, wrestling with the same questions. Marcus didn't get fired that day, or the next, but he also didn't get any clarity. Richard didn't call him back in, didn't send an email, didn't acknowledge what had happened. It was like the conversation had been erased, but Marcus could feel the shift. Other managers stopped looping him into meetings. His emails took longer to get responses. He wasn't imagining it. He was being iced out. Elena didn't know any of this. She came to work the next day and the day after that, same as always. Marcus watched her sometimes from across the office, wondering if she had any idea how close she'd come to losing everything. He didn't tell her. What would he even say? Hey, just so you know, I almost ruined your Christmas, but I decided not to. It felt patronizing, self-congratulatory. So he stayed quiet and waited to see what would happen. Christmas came and went. The office shut down for a few days. Marcus spent the holiday distracted, checking his email compulsively, waiting for the other shoe to drop. His wife finally asked him what was wrong. He told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You did the right thing. Even if it costs us, you did the right thing." He wanted to believe her, but right and expensive feel like enemies when you're the one paying the bill. When everyone came back after New Year's, there was a meeting. All staff. Richard stood at the front of the room and announced a new performance management system. Stricter attendance policies, formal warnings for minor infractions, a probationary period for anyone who didn't meet standards. He didn't mention Elena by name, but Marcus knew. This was retaliation. This was Richard's way of saying, if you won't help me cut the dead weight, I'll build a system that does it for me. Over the next 2 months, 3 people were let go under the new system. All of them were in similar situations to Elena. Hourly workers, family responsibilities, minor attendance issues, but solid work. The message was clear. Richard was cleaning house, and he was doing it in a way that looked like policy, not cruelty. Marcus started losing sleep. He'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, his mind spinning. He kept thinking about those 3 people. He wondered if his refusal to fire Elena had actually made things worse. If he'd just done what Richard asked, maybe the others would have been spared. Maybe Richard would have made his example and moved on. Instead, Marcus had forced him to build a machine that could do the firing without requiring anyone's conscience. This is the part of the story where Marcus came to see me. He called my office, said he was having panic attacks, couldn't focus at work, kept replaying the same moments over and over. When he sat down in my office for the first time, he looked exhausted. He told me the whole story in one sitting, barely paused, like he'd been holding it in and it was finally pouring out. When he finished, he asked me, did I do the right thing, or did I just make everything worse because I wanted to feel good about myself? I see this all the time. People come to me after they've made a moral stand, and instead of feeling proud, they feel crushed by the complexity of the consequences. They thought doing the right thing would feel clear, but instead it feels muddy and painful and full of unintended damage. Here's what I told Marcus, and I want you to hear it too because I think a lot of us need this permission. You can't control everything that happens after you make a choice. You can't control what other people do with their power. What you can control is whether you participate in harm when you see it clearly in front of you. Richard was always going to do what Richard was going to do. He was brought in to cut costs and establish control. If Marcus had fired Elena, Richard would have found another target. If Marcus had stayed silent about the new policies, Richard would have implemented them anyway. The system wasn't Marcus's to fix, but the choice in that moment to say, "I'm not going to be the one to do this," that was his. The human mind wants certainty. It wants to believe that if we just choose correctly, everything will work out. But life doesn't offer that deal. Sometimes choosing integrity means accepting that you can't protect everyone, that you can't control the larger forces at play, that the best you can do is refuse to be the instrument of someone else's cruelty. We worked on this for weeks, Marcus and I, unpacking his guilt, his fear, his anger at Richard, his frustration with himself for not being able to do more. We talked about the difference between responsibility and complicity. We talked about what it means to live with uncertainty when you've tried to do the right thing. Slowly, he started to sleep again. The panic attacks lessened. He started to see that what he was carrying wasn't guilt for a wrong choice. It was grief for a situation he couldn't fully fix. Then, about 4 months after that initial confrontation, something shifted. Elena came to Marcus's office one afternoon. She closed the door, which she'd never done before. She said she needed to tell him something. She'd gotten a job offer from another company, better pay, better benefits, closer to her daughter's school. She was giving her 2 weeks' notice. She thanked him for giving her a chance when she needed it most, for being patient when she struggled with the schedule. She said working there had helped her get back on her feet after a really hard few years. Then she paused. She said, "I don't know if you know this, but someone told me what happened, that Richard wanted you to fire me before Christmas and you refused." Marcus told me his heart started pounding. He didn't know what to say. She kept going. She said, "I don't know if you'll ever understand what that meant. I was barely holding it together. If I'd lost that job, I would have lost everything. My apartment, probably. My ability to take care of my kids. It would have broken me." Her voice cracked. She said, "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to put yourself at risk for someone you barely knew. But you did. And I want you to know it mattered. It really, really mattered." Marcus told me he couldn't speak. She thanked him again, shook his hand, and left. He sat at his desk for a long time after she was gone, and something released in him that he hadn't even known he was holding. It wasn't that her gratitude made his choice worth it. It wasn't transactional like that. It was that he'd been carrying this story as a failure, as something he'd mishandled, as a choice that had spiraled into unintended harm. But here was Elena telling him that the one thing he had actually controlled, the one moment where he'd had power, had meant everything. Tell me, when's the last time you stood up for someone, even when it cost you something? I want to hear your stories. That's what this channel is about. Not just listening to mine, but sharing yours. Marcus stayed at that company for another year. Richard left eventually, fired by the board for failing to hit his targets. The new leadership loosened some of the harsher policies, and the culture started to shift again. Marcus thought about leaving a dozen times, but in the end, he stayed because he realized something. Running from a hard situation doesn't make you braver. It just moves the problem. When he finally did leave, it was on his own terms. He found a better position at a company whose values aligned more closely with his own. But he told me that the conversation with Richard, that moment in the office when he said, "I'm not doing that," changed how he saw himself. It became a reference point, a line he'd drawn. And knowing that line existed made every other decision a little bit clearer. So what's the lesson here? Because I don't want to just tell you a story and leave you with warm feelings. I want you to walk away with something you can actually use. First, doing the right thing won't always feel good. In fact, it will often feel terrible. You'll second-guess yourself, you'll wonder if you're naive, if you're making things worse, if you're being reckless with your own security. That discomfort doesn't mean you chose wrong. It means you're living in the gap between who you've been and who you're becoming. Second, you can't control what happens after your choice. You can't control whether the person you stand up for will appreciate it, whether the system will change, whether other people will follow your lead. You can only control whether you participate in harm when you recognize it. And sometimes that has to be enough. Third, moral courage isn't about grand gestures. It's not about waiting for the perfect moment to be a hero. It's about the small, terrifying decisions we make in rooms where no one's watching, where the stakes are personal and the consequences are real. It's about looking someone in the eye and saying, "No, I'm not doing that," even when your voice is shaking. Here's what I learned from Marcus, and from the hundreds of other people who've sat in my office over the years wrestling with these same questions. We become who we are in the moments when it would be easier to look away. We define ourselves not by what we say we believe, but by what we're willing to risk when those beliefs are tested. Marcus didn't save Elena's life. She saved her own life. She was resourceful, determined, and she found another job. But he gave her time. He gave her dignity. He refused to be the person who kicked her when she was already down. And in doing that, he gave himself something too. Proof that when it mattered, he could choose integrity over safety. You're going to face moments like this. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe not with as much at stake. But you'll be asked to compromise, to look the other way, to prioritize convenience over conscience. And in those moments, you'll have to decide who you want to be. I can't tell you what the right choice is in your specific situation. I don't know your life, your pressures, your responsibilities. But I can tell you this. The people I've seen who carry the most regret aren't the ones who took risks and faced consequences. They're the ones who stayed safe and betrayed themselves. They're the ones who, years later, can still remember the moment they looked away, and they hate themselves a little bit for it. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to fix every broken system. You don't have to save everyone. But when you see harm happening in front of you, and you have even a small amount of power to refuse participation, use it. Even if your hands shake, even if you're scared, even if it costs you something. Because here's the truth I've learned after decades of listening to people's stories. We don't regret the times we were brave. We regret the times we weren't. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. Tell me about a time you had to make a hard choice. Tell me what you learned. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because I've got more of these stories. And I think they matter. I think we need them. I think in a world that's constantly asking us to compromise and stay quiet and protect ourselves above all else, we need reminders that there's another way. Take care of yourself. Be kind to the people around you. And when the moment comes, and it will come, be brave enough to say no to the wrong thing, even when it's hard. Thanks for listening.